the fire presenting in this webinar. Of course, this type of project takes much more than just funding, and Pennsylvania Game Commission has been invaluable in terms of their enthusiasm and effort in finding and collecting the fire history sites that we'll be reporting. And so any success that we've enjoyed is due in large part to their enthusiasm and contributions. And so pictured here is just a small number of the folks who helped. There's many beyond on these folks. And so thank you very much to the Pennsylvania Game Commission. Today we're going to briefly present a management perspective for which our research, the context for which our research sits in. And we will then move on to the study objectives, describe the design and methods and types of data that we'll be using, and go into results and discussion. We'll provide summary data for all of the sites that we've conducted so far within this study, and we'll look a little closer at 2 sites in particular, and then I will hand it over to Mike Stambaugh, who will present some preliminary findings considering all of the fire history sites within our study. Regarding the Pennsylvania Game Commission and other management perspectives throughout the eastern U.S., the PGC manages 1.5 million acres on over 330 tracts. They have a very specific management mandate for wildlife conservation and hunting opportunity. And the recent Pennsylvania Wildlife Action Plan cited fire exclusion as a major threat to key habitats for species of greatest conservation need. So within that understanding, the Game Commission is currently working to restore woodland and savanna habitats across Pennsylvania. And this slide offers a good example of what is ongoing throughout the eastern U.S. in terms of a increased focus on natural ecosystem restoration. And this slide demonstrates well, I think, a trend that managers across the region will recognize of increased acreages being treated with one form of restoration activity or another. Here is the acreage per year included in prescribed burning across Pennsylvania Game Commission lands. And though the exact years might differ across the region, this trend is certainly familiar to folks across the eastern U.S. in general. And so it's within this context that our research and this study rests within. The goal of this work and the restoration activity is not to aim towards restoration of some previous condition, but instead is to provide a frame of reference for assessing modern patterns and processes, as well as to provide an increased ability to set achievable and sustainable management goals. This philosophy is outlined thoroughly in the publication we see here by Swetnam and others in 1999. Our study objectives include to quantify the historical fire regimes of remnant pine communities in Pennsylvania from fire-scarred live and dead pine trees, to discuss the implications of these findings to fire, vegetation, and wildlife management, and to investigate associations among fire events, human populations, and climate conditions. The data we use to perform these investigations include the fire record, which for us in this study consists of dated fire scars on pine stumps, snags, and living trees. The climate data we used was the Palmer Drought Severity Indices, published by Cook et al. And the cultural information consists of written records, which includes treaties and township and county records. Closer look at the fire scar record here. We have examples of the three types of sampling that occurred. On the left is a fire-scarred pine stump. The middle picture shows a partial cross-section removed from a living fire-scarred pine tree. And on the right is a standing snag with a fire scar cat face. So a closer look at one type in particular, the pine stumps. We see here a picture of including the side profile picture, which shows that these remnant materials are often highly degraded, much as rotted and burned away. We reveal the cross-section plane using a chainsaw, and when we do so, we see that there's a surprisingly amount of intact information in these apparently highly degraded materials. And these cross-sections are brought back to our laboratory where they are sanded and polished to a very high level so to reveal cellular detail. And using standard dendrochronology techniques, we match the pattern of ring growth exhibited in these undated dead pieces of wood with a master tree ring growth chronology developed from living trees from that site. And once we do this, it allows us to assign actual years to each and every tree ring represented on or shown on the samples, which then allows us to assign a calendar year to each individual fire scar, which is shown here of a pitch pine. We actually can achieve greater than annual resolution with this fire scar information. We do this as outlined by Kay and Swetnam in 1999, in which, based on fire scar position, the actual season in which the tree received the injury can be identified. On the left-hand photo here, we show two dormant season fire scars, and so the first instance of cambial response appears between the late wood growing of the previous year and before the early wood formation begins in the subsequent year. And so in this instance, we assign the fire scar to the calendar year showing that first year of response. Alternately, the image on the right-hand screen shows a injury which was received during the growing season for that tree. We see that just above the arrow, we can see that the early portion of the early wood has already been laid down, and after that, the initial cambial response is visible. For pitch pine trees in Pennsylvania, the growing season is approximately from May to September, and the dormant season is approximately September through April. So for a fire history site, it is a very discrete amount of area. This is a schematic showing a hypothetical site which has live trees and stumps and snags. When we identify a fire scar on a tree from a site and it's dated, the evidence points to evidence of a fire occurring in a portion of the study site. And for our research, the criteria for a fire history site is that this be contained to approximately 1 square kilometer, and a minimum of 20 to 50 trees are sampled, that there be at minimum 100 fire scars spanning 3 centuries, and we also sample small and large trees as well as young and old to help avoid scarring biases based on tree size or age. For this study, we identified the areas of interest that you can see here by the red polygons, both in the Ridge and Valley and the Allegheny Plateau regions of Pennsylvania. And a extensive field campaign occurred, and which was informed greatly by PGC managers. And we scouted and surveyed many, many public land sites within these regions. And ultimately, we identified the 9 sites that we see here on the screen as having sufficient material for us to conduct the fire history research. We had the benefit of previous research. We had of ours in cooperation with the similar project partners. These indicated in blue dots are 3 fire history sites in the Pine Creek Gorge that we can include now in this entire data set for consideration. And I'll point out quickly that there are 2 publications have been put out on the 3 Pine Creek Valley sites. Patrick Brose took the lead on those manuscripts, and we recently published our findings on the results from 2 fire history sites in the central Ridge and Valley portion of our study site, and that can be found in the Forest Journal. So I'm going to give a very general overview description of the sites which were included in this study. Nearly all are located on Pennsylvania state game lands. The one exception is that which is located on Shriner Mountain on Bald Eagle State Forest, which is land administered by the Pennsylvania Bureau of Forestry. By and large, they're all on xeric ridgetop and upper slope landscape positions. And these are oak pine stands which are embedded within a matrix of dry oak and northern hardwood forests. The species that we sampled include pitch, red, Table Mountain, and shortleaf pine. And these pine trees that I just mentioned are notably rare within the overstory of the stands within which we sampled. And instead, chestnut oak, black gum, and black birch are the currently dominate the forest canopy. And as an interesting aside, American chestnut sprouts were prevalent at nearly all of the sites. The entire time period which is covered by the samples we collected spans approximately from the early 1600s to modern times. We divided this entire period of record into 3 different cultural eras for our analysis and consideration of the data. These are what we term the pre-European settlement, the European settlement, and the fire suppression eras. And so the pre-European settlement era, it does not reflect a period which is free of European influence. It's well understood that colonial settlement on the eastern seaboard of the U.S. had already led to increased intra-native conflict and decreased Native American populations by the time our tree ring record picks up. The European settlement era reflects a point at which European settlers began populating the local environment of a study site. I apologize, the text on this slide is kind of smushed up, but we identified the transition date between the pre-European settlement era and the European settlement era using treaties and land purchases, as well as county history publications and settlement dates of nearby towns. These transition dates are indicated on the map on the right-hand side of the screen in the white boxes. And the fire suppression era for all sites was placed beginning at 1915, which was when the Pennsylvania Bureau of Forest Protection formed. The results of all of these studies can be described in terms of three different fire regime metrics. We'll be presenting information on all 9 sites for these 3 metrics. These are fire frequency, seasonality, and severity. For frequency, we'll be discussing these in terms of their mean fire interval, which is the average number of years between fire years, and we'll also point out the range of this data. Seasonality is based upon the scar position within the annual growth for which that scar is formed, and severity we'll be describing in terms of the percentage of trees scarred per fire year. Below this text, we see a fire history diagram that was created in the FHX2 computer program developed by Dr. Henry Gracino-Mayer. And I'll just go through this quickly. Each horizontal line shows the period of record for an individual tree which was sampled. The vertical ticks on each of these lines indicate fire scars that were identified on those samples. For each horizontal line on the left-hand side, which is the inside of that tree, a vertical line indicates that pith was present, and a slanted line indicates that pith, the very center ring of the tree, was not present. And similarly, on the right-hand side of each horizontal line, a vertical line indicates that bark was present, so we were able to identify the last year that tree grew. And a slanted line indicates that bark was not present, so we cannot assign an absolute date for that tree's demise. At the very bottom of this graph, encircled here in red, is the composite fire interval. And so this includes any year for which any tree received and recorded a fire scar. And this is the information, this is the data that we use for all of our fire interval statistics. And for all of our sites, we restricted our fire scar analysis to time periods that included at least 3 trees recording. Beyond fire scar information, we can also get some information about forest dynamics. Here, circled in green, we are able to infer cohort establishment events and also cohort mortality events. And of course, all of this data rests within these cultural time periods, which we just went over and are pictured here in the colored blocks below. Now, this red circle shows the era of infrequent fire during the fire suppression period, and all of our sites exhibited this very similar amount of fire during this period, and so we've excluded that from all of our analysis and all of the summary statistics I'm about to show. They don't include the fire suppression era, but do know that it's very similar to what we see here. There are a few instances where sites did record 1 or 2 fires during this time period, but it's a very consistent trend across all of these sites. So we generated this summary data for all 9 sites. Here we can see on the screen. And we're going to go through these fairly quickly, just in terms of the summary statistics, and I'll point out a few interesting points about each one of these fire metrics that we talked about. So the first result is the frequency as described by the mean fire interval for each site. For the next few slides, the tables are going to look fairly similar, and the sites are organized in a north to south order. So here for the mean fire interval, I've circled the minimum and maximum value for each different time period. Starting on the left is the pre-European settlement time period. The next to the right is the European settlement era, and all the way to the right is the all-time, which includes the entire period of fire record for those individual sites. So we can see that during the pre-European era, it ranged from about 5.5 to nearly 18 years. Their mean is below for all sites, and so circled in green. For the European settlement time period, we see a minimum of 3 and a maximum of about 6 for the mean fire interval. And this trend is consistent for each and every site. There is a decrease in interval length, thus indicating an increase in fire frequency between the pre-European settlement and the European settlement period. For the fire interval range, so we can see here, I think the really interesting point is that during the European settlement period, each and every one of our 9 sites had occurrences of annual burning. And we can see that the variability in terms of range is restricted or greatly decreased for the European settlement period. It's a range of 1 to almost 16 years compared to the pre-European settlement period, which ranged from 3 to 31 years. For mean percent scarred, which is that metric of fire severity, we didn't identify a so easily discernible pattern. The average for all the sites hovered right around 30%, indicating that on average 1 in 3 trees in the record was injured per fire year. And here a break from tables, but moving to a graph. We see this is describing the seasonality at all of the sites, all 9 sites combined. Pre-European settlement time period is on the left. We can see that dormant season fires dominated the entire record, and there were, though, nearly 12% of the fire scars were. I didn't do that highlight mark, but we'll just move through with it being present on the screen. But we see that during the pre-European and the European settlement record, growing season scars did occur, or growing season fires did occur. It appears that there were slightly more or more growing season fires in the pre-European settlement period compared to the European settlement period, but that hasn't been statistically tested at this point. We're going to look just a little closer at 2 sites here. This is State Game Land 88 and State Game Land 107. You can see their locations in the map on the right-hand corner of the screen. And for this, we start off by asking 2 questions. Were fire frequency or severity associated with drought conditions? We tested this using superposed epoch analysis and separately correlation analysis using Palmer drought severity indices for our drought condition data. And we also asked the question that were fire frequencies statistically different between sites or cultural time periods, and we used KS goodness of fit tests for this question. This shows we have the FHX2 diagram for both sites, and on the table above those we have the fire frequency metric, which is the mean fire interval, and you can also see the time periods and the actual years that were encompassed per site for each of these in the row indicated as years. Asterisk here indicates significant difference. So for State Game Land 107, the pre-European settlement MFI, mean fire interval, was 12 compared to 4 during the European settlement period, and that was a statistically significant difference. No such difference existed for State Game Land 88, however. And this slide shows the mean percent scarred. So this is our fire severity metric. And here we did see, indicated by the small superscript letters paired between sites, that there was a significant difference in the percent trees scarred per fire year from 107 to State Game Land 88. The graph at the bottom of the screen shows the same information, with the red lines being the percentage scarred per fire year for 107 compared to the blue lines showing that same metric for State Game Land 88. And so we can summarize these findings by answering those questions we posed previously. Were fire frequency or severity associated with drought conditions? After testing, we identified no significant associations between this frequency or severity with drought conditions. And were these fire frequencies different between sites or cultural time periods? Well, they didn't differ statistically between sites. However, they did differ statistically between time periods at State Game Land 107. And so in summary for this analysis, including the two sites, we find that fire regimes of Pennsylvania Ridge and Valley remnant pitch pine communities were historically frequent, predominantly of low to moderate severity, and occurred overwhelmingly more frequently during the dormant season compared to the growing season. And so with that, I'm going to hand over the floor to Mike.
Okay, this is Mike Stambaugh, and what I want to do is kind of take a little bit of a step back and look at some of the larger trends in fire regimes in the eastern U.S. and kind of share with you some of our directions of analyses that we are conducting with this set of Pennsylvania data. For me, fire regimes in the eastern U.S., whether it's the data that we've produced or if you look into publications of others, often it kind of boils down to at least three major factors. One on the left being the variability in climate across the country. This is a map that was developed by Rich Guyette, myself, and some others that predicted the variability in historical fire frequency across the United States simply from temperature and precipitation. The model does really well. It's amazingly powerful. For Pennsylvania, it was right on, more or less, for the new data we have. So climate explains quite a lot in terms of the historical frequency of fire. But certainly we know on top of that, climate control, we have other factors that can also change fire frequency or influence fire frequency, such as humans. This is a map in the middle of human population density around 1580 by Driver and Massey. So certainly we see there's a lot of variability in human populations across the U.S. at that time. Humans influence fire regimes in many different ways. And then on the far right, certainly the land, be it topography, slope, wetlands, all different factors of the land can also influence fire frequency. Now, one thing I don't show here is lightning, and certainly lightning can play a significant factor in influencing fire regimes. Rarely do we have very good historical data or kind of a process information in terms of how lightning may have acted in the past. And what I'm going to do is primarily focus on human influence in this discussion. maybe you believe, or maybe you don't believe, that humans were that important in historical fire regimes, but certainly humans, we have evidence that humans influence fire regimes, and in the future, human relationships with fire are going to be increasingly important. Certainly we see the recent large fires in the eastern U.S. being influenced by humans, and that trend is likely to continue in the future. Probably one of the more classic papers dealing with the influences of humans on fire regimes comes from Missouri Ozarks in a study conducted by Rich Guyette and others in 2002. These data are from a landscape dominated by short-leaf pine, and what you can see on the top graph is percent sites burned from about 1700 up into the mid-1900s. And so the region went through Native American period, transitioned into Eastern Native American immigration into the area, followed by Euro-American settlement, agricultural development, and then fire suppression. And you can think of this line through here as fire activity. And so fire activity starts to increase as you see the Eastern Native Americans immigrating into the area. At the bottom shown population density of the different tribes, and you can see lots of tribes were moving in from the further east into the region, and the result was this increase in fire activity. Fire activity continued to increase even though the population changed into a Euro-American settlement, and then came back down through fire suppression. And so one thing I want you to focus on here is this wave pattern in fire activity within this region. You see the wave increasing with Eastern Native American immigration, peaks with Euro-American settlement, and then comes down the other side as more and more fire suppression activities occur. So we have a large set of data now in Pennsylvania, 12 sites, maybe somewhere over 600 trees, over 1,000 fire scars. So we have a lot of opportunity to look at the relationships between fire and through time. Again, this is all the data minus actually one site in Pennsylvania. And one thing we're seeing is that these sites, the commonality in fire years is strongest related to how far apart they are. So for example, 53 and 81 share more years, common fire years, as say 53 and 88, which is further away. So we see distance is a huge factor in terms of whether or not the fire years are shared between sites. Another thing we see is a wave-like pattern that is very similar to the one that we see in Missouri. And this is a somewhat complex diagram, so I'm going to try to walk you through it here. What I have in each of these panels is fires per decade plotted through time. And so we're going from about 1600 to present, and then at the top we have Site 53, which is actually the first site being settled, and then at the bottom we have Site 100, which is the last site settled. Settlement here is indicated by the star, and so each of these stars on the different waves shows when this site went through Euro-American settlement based on the treaty information as well as the county level information that we've been able to collect. And one thing that you can see, particularly as you move through the middle of the diagram, is this wave-like pattern in fire activity that occurs at each of the sites. Now, some of the sites reach higher fire activity during that wave. Some are much lower, like the top site, but all of them follow a wave-like pattern that seems to be associated with the processes that happened during Euro-American settlement. Many of these sites saw Native Americans being pushed out, Euro-Americans moving in, and all of the peaks in these waves occur after a settlement has actually happened. So you see the star, and then fire frequency continues to increase at the site. And as you look down through these, you can see the wave gets progressively later in time as you move in a northern direction. And so basically what you're seeing is a propagation of what we call a wave of fire that is moving across the state of Pennsylvania, somewhere around 1750 to 1850, depending on what site you're at. If on the right are 3 panels of the progression of settlement. This is published by Florin in 1977. So the gray portions of these Pennsylvania maps show areas that were previously settled, and then the black shows the areas that were settled during a decade. The top panel here being 1720, the middle panel showing you the settlement from 1760 to 1770, and then by 1820, most of the state had been settled. Really, the northern tier was underway, and very few places were considered unsettled by Florin. Let's see. Okay, we've been working on this wave of fire concept for quite a while, and we're approaching 100 fire history sites across, I think, 23 states east of the Rocky Mountains. And on the left, I'm showing you these waves of fire from basically the southeast. So at the top, this is fire history data from Alabama, moving towards the northwest, and then at the bottom of this graph, we're looking at the waves of fire that we see on the western side of the Great Plains. So what we see are large amplitude changes in fire frequency, particularly on the eastern seaboard and coming from the different coasts. And by the time you get out into the region of the Great Plains, the wave is much smaller, as well as much shorter lived. This progression we're still working on different tests, but Pennsylvania fits very nicely within this progression. It would be as an eastern seaboard kind of location. It has an earlier wave of fire, fits very nicely in time with this larger trend. This wave has all kinds of implications when it comes to what the vegetation was like, both pre and post wave, as well as when we, for instance, describe the historical vegetation. In many cases, this wave of fire had already happened. So on each of these curve forms, you can see a green portion of them highlighted, and those green portions represent the period of time in which either the General Land Office survey notes were made or other major descriptions that are used to describe vegetation were made. So in almost every case, those descriptions were made after this wave of fire had already passed. Other important trends we see associated with this wave, particularly in Pennsylvania, what I want you to focus on first are these black trees. They look like arrows. But each of these black trees represents a major increase in tree cohort establishment. And one thing we see is the establishment of pine trees preceding a kind of a decrease in fire. So if you look down through these, each of these major cohort establishments occur before a decrease in fire. And what we think is going on here is that regeneration is occurring all throughout this period of time, but it's not until this regeneration is followed by a decrease in fire activity that we actually see the cohort survive and be represented forward in time. There seems to be a very large region-wide increase in trees across our sites in the 1740 to 1755 era. The Albany Purchase was a big factor in many of our sites, and during that period we see a decrease in fire activity, which allowed a large component of trees to be developed across the Pennsylvania region. Now, many of our sites were logged in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and that's a good reason why we see a large component of hardwood trees as in the overstory of these forests today. But it's also a reason for that is, of course, the lack of fire. And I wouldn't be surprised if the different age distributions of these sites represent a combination of logging date as well as the last fire date. So some of these sites are probably younger or older depending on when the last fire activity occurred at the site. So just a little bit about future work. Currently we are working on analyses that look at how spatially extensive historical fire years were. We have a lot of data at the site level, so we can look at how extensive fires were within sites. We have a lot of data at across the region, so we can look at how extensive fires were across the whole state. What we're working on now is the landscape scale. So how extensive were these fires within, say, the 1 kilometer to 100 kilometer square extent. And then also we're looking at the regeneration and survival of trees within these frequent fire regimes. So when did these trees establish and survive based on the variability in the fire record? And one other component that we're looking at is the relative influence of climate versus human influences. We're conducting different analyses looking at only high severity versus only low severity fires, as well as periods of frequent versus infrequent fire, and how that's associated with the drought record or the larger oscillations, particularly those that are associated with the Atlantic Ocean. One thing we know about the northeastern U.S. in particular is that historically large fires did occur, termed dark days or red days, and we're interested in determining whether or not there are specific climate scenarios that are associated with those. So in conclusion, I think from this data, it's fairly obvious that there's really tremendous potential for understanding history of fire, not only in Pennsylvania but throughout the northeastern U.S. over at least the last 4 centuries. At least in Pennsylvania, humans were a very important determinant of fire, and not only did that change the occurrence of fire, but it also led to likely large changes in vegetation that are still present on the landscape today. And then finally, I guess one of the points I would like to emphasize is that, on some of these trees, I look at these wounds as almost like an open mouth, telling us the history of fire and people, and that we should think of these trees as potentially cultural artifacts that have a lot of information to tell us about not only fire but the people and the land. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge the support of Pennsylvania Game Commission in particular, but also the support of many different agencies that have allowed us to put the results of this work into a larger scale context. Okay,
wow.
That's it.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you both so much for that presentation. We have questions just kind of pouring into the chat box, so I'm going to have to, I'll try to make sure we get to them. Just for folks on the line, we probably can go a little bit after 1 o'clock Eastern. Would that work for you, Joe and Mike?
That sounds good.
All right, if need be. All right. So thank you again for that great presentation. I'll dive in with the first question that came in. Bob Kremens asked, since most of the fires are dormant season, would you expect drought conditions to affect fire frequency?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Sure thing. Bob Kremens asks, since most of the fires are dormant season, would you expect drought conditions to affect fire frequency?
Oh, that's not an easy question. You know, the effects of drought can be short-lived or very long-lived and persistent. So each drought can have its own signature, you know, be severe at first, but then you know, less severe but prolonged. It's really difficult to just give one answer for that. Even in years where, you know, it may be somewhat wet, just a few weeks of dry weather can be associated with fire occurrence. So I don't have a straightforward answer. Certainly in some of the small analyses that Joe worked on in his paper, we didn't see a strong association between fire occurrence and drought, but even so, often those types of results change as you get more data and look at a larger regional analysis.
Okay, great, thank you. There is hopefully a brief question. It's are other correlations studied, for example, aspect, soil type, or just distance between sites?
Related to... Hello?
Yep.
Okay.
So
we had a phone malfunction here. I thought we lost you for a second.
Oh, no, we're here. We're here.
So okay, I copied that question, and I've moved to one slide which can offer a little bit of information on that. In the study for that included state game lands 88 and 107, result that I didn't report on or an analysis is that I'm drawing this line here. State game land 88 allowed us to look at effect of aspect on fire frequency because there's actually a county line that was separating two counties running right through the middle of that ridge top, and we had a sufficient number of samples with a north aspect to compare to those which had a south aspect, and there we didn't find any statistically significant differences in terms of fire frequency. However, the number of fire years were double on the south side than those on the north side, and so we did walk away from that with the impression that aspect did have a meaningful effect on fire frequency. At this point, with the larger data set, we have not had the opportunity to look at any of these ideas that are suggested here in terms of soil or aspect or landscape position. But that one study, we did see a difference between north and south aspects.
Got it. Thanks. While we're on that thread, another question came in just now from Craig Ostrowski. Did you look at fire frequency and time of year in relation to vertical position on the landscape, valley floor versus ridgetop?
No, we did not look at the changes in fire frequency, say, by elevation.
Okay, great. So moving back to our questions in order, Bob Warnerell says, it would appear that your N numbers are much lower in the pre-Euro settlement era, so standard deviations would be much higher, and I would expect a much lower confidence of the mean FRI during that time. Yet you don't show those differences in standard error or deviation.
I think for that comment, we're very confident in the fire return intervals beginning, say in the mid-1600s forward. Often, like as Joe pointed out, 1 in 3 trees record a fire of any fire, and as you get earlier and earlier in the record, actually the trees are getting smaller and smaller, and in many cases they're becoming better fire recorders than large trees. So we're confident in the fire intervals that we're reporting.
Okay, great, thanks. There was a comment that came in, really beautiful data sets. I think other folks would probably echo that as well. I'll move on to the next question. Kevin Smith says, Mike and Joe, can you estimate a proportion of trees with closed fire scars or with trees with multiple open scars?
Yeah, I couldn't really estimate a proportion, but I would say that a large majority were open fire scars on these trees.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question, hopefully, all right, well, I'll read it. So can you speculate about the fire regimen in Pennsylvania before, say, 1450, long before European diseases could have decreased indigenous population?
We can speculate, but of course, it's kind of without data in some cases. So one thing that we do know is that when we begin these records, they are comprised of pine species that are more fire tolerant. Had there been large periods without fire, I don't know that we would see a presence, especially at the abundance at which we see these species available beginning in the late 1500s or early 1600s. Now, one thing that's interesting, particularly if you look at the charcoal data, and I haven't seen the regional charcoal data, but the North American charcoal data, is that there is a decrease in fire activity in the late 1500s through the mid-1600s, which one could speculate that is due to depopulation of Native Americans. Maybe there was some other larger scale climate effect, but certainly looking back in time, it is possible that there is variability that we're not able to capture in the last 4 centuries.
Great, thanks. A related question somewhat, have any correlations been made between your fire data and pollen core analyses that provide info on forest types and communities?
The short answer of that is no. A lot of the pollen core data are coarser resolution in longer and temporal scale. That's not something that we've done so far, but I suppose if there was a good lake for sampling pollen, that one could look at calibrating, say, the pollen record to our fire record.
Got it, thank you. So another question, could we expect frequent fire, perhaps annual, to decrease the actual scarring of the trees, to leave trees without scars?
Yes, certainly. That is shown kind of anecdotally in our data where fire, I'm going to kind of slide over to that slide, mean percent. So we did see mean percent scarred. We haven't had the opportunity to test this statistically yet, though there did seem to be an associated decrease in severity with an increase in fire frequency for those time periods. And but we haven't tested that statistically yet, but that trend is visible when looking at the data.
Thank you. I'll share a comment from Dr. Patterson. He says young pitch pine are far more likely to be scarred than older trees, and once scarred, a tree is far more likely to be scarred again than trees not previously scarred. So it does not surprise me that the largest, oldest pitch pine I have seen show little evidence of ever being scarred. Very interesting. We had another question that from Inga says, have you been able to address any implications of these data for the PGC?
We haven't worked specifically with PGC managers in terms of what do these data mean for management, but I think we're coming to that step. Certainly what our role is to generate these data sets, and they provide a lot of food for thought. I think one important point that wasn't brought up yet about these long-term data sets is that just because fire was a certain frequency in the past, it may not have all been fire that was conducive to or even would be recommended in terms of a prescription for a certain species. So the next thing for us to do, particularly through the regeneration survival analysis, is to look closer at what fire frequencies or intervals are related to, say, pitch pine success, and so get away from just looking at the historical record and looking more closely at what portion of the historical record may have been more conducive for certain types of either tree regeneration or potentially tree mortality.
Great, thank you. Let's see, I think it's a little bit after the hour. We'll give folks another minute to type questions in if they have them. In the meantime, I just definitely want to say thank you again. This has been a really, really fascinating webinar, and this webinar is being recorded, and we will post a recording on the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange website. Give folks a few more seconds to type in a question if they've got it.
Yeah, Amanda, I also wanted to point out, I saw a question scroll through earlier from Kathleen that asked,
darn.
It caught my eye because it's really interesting to me. We mentioned the existence of chestnut sprouts on the sites, and she asked if we were able to collect any fire scar data on those stumps. No, we certainly weren't. We did see also some remnant wood material, but there was never anything even approaching the quality that would be needed to assess the fire scarring on those trees. But it is a really kind of fascinating point, I think, that this fire scar data, which now, which are being recorded on these, hard pine trees, what are the implications for chestnut restoration and management? Obviously, there was significant amounts of chestnut on these sites at the same time that there were these frequent, fire regimes. And so that it's really some good food for thought as well.
Yes, definitely. And Kathleen, sorry about missing that question, but thank you very much for addressing it. All right, so we're 5 minutes after the hour, and I don't see any more questions coming into the chat box. So I will take this opportunity. Oh, one more quick comment. There was a request for the citations from one of the earlier slides where you showed the studies that have come out of the work you've been doing. So if you guys would be able to share those citations, we could post those on the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange website as well. So thanks very much, Joe and Mike. This was a wonderful, wonderful presentation, and we really appreciate your taking the time to share your research with us. Thank you. And on behalf of everybody on the webinar, virtual applause, thank you, thank you, thank you. We really appreciate it.
Hey, you bet. We're really happy to participate and grateful for the opportunity, and we're glad that so many people found it worthwhile to attend.
All right, thank you. All right, well, have a great day, everybody, and once again, thanks. We really appreciate your time and your work. Take care.